Welcome to the Psychedelia Podcast, where we talk about the third wave of psychedelics. Through our many wide-ranging conversations with scientists, policymakers, entrepreneurs, and event organizers, we bring you an exclusive look into the many minds of the psychedelic world. It's time to let the word out about psychedelics and how they can be used as tools to benefit both the individual and the community. Welcome to the third wave.
Hello, all listeners, and welcome back to the Psychedelia Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Austin, and I am recording this right now from San Francisco. I'm staying near the Castro Mission area, and I'm in town for the Psychedelic Science Conference, which is this weekend. And I'm super excited because it is the largest gathering yet of psychedelic people, at least in a more organized, formal conference setting. And I can't wait to see what type of discussion happens over the weekend. So I'm here, and you guys will be getting this on Sunday, the last day of the conference. So if you're listening to this and if you happen to be at the conference, please, send me a message or an email or something like that, and I'll be happy to try and find you. So in today's episode, we have a friend of mine who's on the guest. His name is Idahosa. Idahosa. I'll say that once more. Idahosa. When I first met Idahosa, I was living in Lisbon, Portugal, and this was in September of last year, and it took me about a month to get his name correct. So it's Idahosa. And Idahosa is an entrepreneur. He's 28 years old. He's originally from Philadelphia, or close to Philadelphia, I believe Harrisburg in Pennsylvania. And he runs a website called The Mimic Method, which helps students learn foreign languages quickly by improving their pronunciation and immersing themselves in sounds. And Idahosa is one of the most intelligent people that I've ever met. And he has an interesting obsession with personality types, as well as psychedelics, cannabis, and other forms of altered states of consciousness in which we can access flow states to live a better life. So basically, in this podcast, we're going to talk to Idahosa about his experiences with cannabis and other psychedelics, how they've improved his overall life, including his freestyle rapping, increasing his motivation to learn new languages, and also helped the growth of his business. We also discuss how there really is no separation between using psychedelics for spiritual purposes and using psychedelics to help with creativity, how that is actually one and the same because life is all inclusive anyway. And I believe that, you guys are going to learn something new from Idahosa. He's completely outside of the psychedelic space. He really doesn't talk to a lot of other people who do psychedelics. And he has a keen ability to get to the heart of a matter in a way that makes sense. There's no bullshit with Idahosa. He is clear, he's concise, and oftentimes he's right. And so I think you guys will really enjoy his insight into the role of psychedelics in creativity and consciousness. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and share it with a few friends. The more people who listen to this, the better. And if you enjoy the podcast, please support us on Patreon, patreon.com/thethirdwave. We are completely funded right now by what you guys are doing. And as much as I'd like to not have advertisements, so far the response on Patreon has been fairly minimal, which is completely fine and understandable, but I think it's good to be upfront about these things. If we don't start generating some sort of monthly donation for the Patreon page, we will likely have advertisements sooner rather than later. So I'd like to avoid that. So if you feel comfortable donating, please go to our Patreon page and help support the podcast in any way possible. It would also go towards other projects that we're working on at The Third Wave. So enjoy the podcast, and I will see you guys after the show. Let's talk a little bit about the Mimic Method. Can you kind of give some background about what the Mimic Method is and what that business is for you from like an entrepreneurial perspective, but also from like a personal perspective, why you started it, for example?
Yeah, so the Mimic Method is the language philosophy I came up with in 2010, 2011. And what we do is focus on hearing and pronunciation as the core to a person's ability to acquire a foreign language rapidly. And I came up with it while living in Brazil in 2010. I went there after graduating university to focus on Brazilian music and Brazilian jiu-jitsu and also learn Portuguese. And it was actually through focusing on these three areas that one day I had this kind of epiphany. It all kind of converged. And what I realized is that the number one thing that holds people back from learning language is not being tuned in to the sound of the language. So, for example, number one frustration you get from people is either I can't understand native speakers, talk too fast, and they blend the words together, or I can't express myself, fluidly and confidently without stuttering and getting anxious, and people asking me to repeat myself because my accent wasn't clear. So I realized that the root there for understanding, for example, people can't understand because they can't hear. They haven't tuned their ears into the actual nuances and flow and sounds of the language. And they can't speak because they haven't physically trained their mouth to create the sounds. So while I was in Brazil, in Rio, training myself Afro-Brazilian percussion and trying to learn these rhythms, coming up with different techniques to get my own ears and hands to work with these Brazilian sounds, I had an epiphany that, this same technique that I've been using to teach myself how to play Brazilian drums, I can use this technique to teach people how to hear and pronounce. And there's a huge gap in the market where we have, there's a $1 billion industry of language learning, and people teach you how to memorize vocabulary and how to memorize the rules of grammar and translate things. But no one really tells you how to pronounce anything. The most they'll do is not really, moving on, So I thought it was a huge pain point, but a huge gap in the market. So I came up with this technique for how to teach pronunciation, put it into a product, put it online, and that became like a location-independent business for me for several years, funded my travels. And then in recent years, took it more seriously and started building up a team and more products and growing the ambitions in the company.
So, where did your initial interest in languages come from? Why, can you give us some of that background? I know you lived in China for a year, right, where you learned Chinese.
Yeah, so my first language I learned was Spanish. So I grew up in the U.S. in just random, a suburban town in America, just bored out of my mind since I was a kid. And I always spoke English, and I'm always looking for ways to get out. I didn't really care much for my hometown. So I got the opportunity to go to Mexico to study Spanish when I was 17. And it was my first time traveling abroad on my own as an adult. And it was a game-changing experience for me because it was just wow, life in Mexico is just way better than life back home in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And but then that's where I learned Spanish, and just that experience of coming to a place where everyone's very alien to you. Even at the time, it was 2006. It was the first time, at least in my memory, that immigration was the hot button issue, and they're these aliens are coming over here, blah blah. It was super racist against Mexicans, and so I wanted to go there myself and see what's going on. And yeah, these people they're very alien to me because I didn't speak their language, but through the process of mimicking them and having conversation, they eventually transition from alien to human, and I can understand a Mexican just as well as I can understand you. And just that experience of going to a new place, seeing the world from a different perspective, different culture, and then humanizing an entire population of people was just a really powerful experience to me when I was 17. And I was man, I got to keep doing this. So I went to university, studied Chinese, went to China for study abroad, learned Chinese there. Same kind of experience of crazy Asian culture. And then once again, being able to communicate and connect with the people. Then Brazil after that when I graduated. And since then, I've also learned to speak French and German. And I'm actually learning Italian right now because my roommate's Italian here in Portugal. But yeah, that's how I got into it. And I always tell people I don't really care about language per se. A lot of people are really nerdy about the theory of language, the grammar of language. But for me, I've always seen language as a tool to connect my fellow human beings around the globe. And what I'm really looking for is a better understanding of people, a better understanding of culture. And language is the number one tool in my toolbox to do that.
So, and we've had lots of conversations before, obviously, about this. You are a very curious person, and you clearly intellectual pursuits and kind of thinking about ideas and working on ideas and everything. For you, at least from my perspective, my interest in travel and my interest in going to various places, it kind of coincides with also my interest in drugs, because I think traveling is an altered state of consciousness in a way when you step outside of the culture that you're so used to being in, really. For you, where does your interest in like substances come from, whether that's cannabis or alcohol or tobacco, or even then, more recently, we've been talking about psychedelics. How has that developed over time?
Yeah, so I grew up like a good student, I was never a rule follower, but like I just didn't have any interest in substances because I had only known to associate it with like deadbeats at the time, and I was a pretty ambitious kid. So I didn't really do any until I got to college, and I would drink like everyone else every once in a while, but even that I didn't really get into. And I can't remember the first time I smoked weed, but I don't remember anything happening the first time. And I had asthma as a kid too, so I was always kind of like had this phobia of like smoke in my lungs. But I guess I got over it at some point, got high, and then I don't remember particularly liking it. I was like a bit paranoid, and and then fell off of it for a while. And then I guess I tried it again. This is a very common story where the first time you don't feel anything, and then the second time you're like, you get like way too high, like you do like a bong hit, and you're just like, oh, screw this is way too much. And then later on you do it again. And what really got me into cannabis use was freestyle rapping. Since I was a kid, I really liked to freestyle rap, which is just rapping to a beat, improvised. It's like one of my favorite activities to do in life because it's just, you just open your brain up to the ethos of ideas and words and language and just try to jump on these words, as they come to you on the beat. And I noticed that when I freestyle sober, depending on my mood, it can be like anywhere from like okay to like really crappy. But every single time I would turn into like this freestyle genius. And it was just crazy because I'm like, man, like all these words that are coming to me, they come to me in slow motion, like the beat's playing and like I just have so much time to think. And B, if I say a word like rhyme, I gotta do a little thing with you. What rhymes with the word rhyme?
Time.
Okay, so everyone says time, right? And what's going on is you're making a mental association between rhyme and time. And so when people do a freestyle rap for the first time, like, hey, I like to make rhymes. I do it all the time, right? And it's like the corniest rap, but everyone does it because that's what it is, right?
Sure.
But now if you smoke weed, right, and I say, hey, what rhymes with rhyme? And then all of a sudden, all these other words and things start coming to your head that you didn't really think about before, like, oh, clementine and serpentine and, sublime. And, and then that's when you're freestyling, like, hey, yo, I spit these rhymes. It makes my mind so sublime. Serpentine swivel in the rhyme, and then and then all of a sudden, like, you just sound way cooler. And so that really got me interested in like what's going on actually in my brain that's different for this creative process of coming up with, freestyle raps. So I started researching it and learning a bunch of things. And so I found that for creativity, I identify as a very creative person and I love creating things. So marijuana is something that enhances my creativity, not just in freestyling, but also generating business ideas and conversation. I've also recently discovered it for physical exercise and being more creative in my movements. So that's what it does for me. It's a thing that expands my mind. So for a while, the only substance I had ever done was marijuana. In fact, I don't even drink that much. So I had a period of time where I didn't drink at all and I'd smoke weed like once a week. But I'd always been frustrated with everyone else's use of marijuana because they only used it for, like, oh, let's just smoke some weed and like veg out and watch some cartoons. And I didn't like that because I'm like, man, when I smoke, I want to read or like talk to people about ideas or play music or freestyle or come up with some stuff. So for me, I've always been trying to like promote not recreational use, but like productive use of marijuana. Like there's certain things you can do in this altered state more effectively than when you're sober. So that's, I think, what led me to looking into psychedelics and the possibilities of even more creativity and different perspective with that.
And so when you were researching what was going on when you smoked cannabis in the brain, what did you discover from that?
Yes. So actually there's some research, maybe I'll find it and send it to you. Basically, the term they use is that marijuana flattens associational hierarchies. And what that means is, like, example before I said to you was rhyme and time. So the brain just works through analogy and association. So in your head, the rhyme is attached to the word time and is always attached there in that rhyming association. But then you smoke weed and then this hierarchy like kind of disassembles and flattens. And now all these other words get an opportunity to be linked to that. Now, it sounds like pretty frivolous in the context of freestyling, but I actually think it's crucial to creativity in general because ideas take the form of language in our brains, right? When you're thinking about what you're going to do with your business or with your relationships or whatever, you're thinking words in your head. And when you flatten those associations, all of a sudden you're seeing things from different angles. And this is essentially what creativity is, just making associations. So what this research was saying, they had like interesting kind of methodologies for testing this, was actually coincidentally really based on my freestyle thing, which is what they call semantic priming, where they did subjects and say like, okay, how many words, how quickly can you associate these words together and find the pair between like a triad of words or something like that. And they found that they were able to do it quicker. They were under the influence of THC than when they were sober. So what kind of research shows you are actually more creative. It's not just a subjective experience for me. Like there's a thing going on in the brain,
And so what would that mean for language learning, specific to like what you've discovered through your own language learning process, or specific to how you're teaching or creating the methodology at the Mimic method?
Yeah. So for speaking language, I actually don't find marijuana that useful. Like, cause like if I'm high, like just the activity of speaking a bunch of languages, it's weird. Like I can freestyle in different languages way better when I'm high when it comes to conversations, just because conversations are just complicated in general when I'm like too high, because trying to understand people's motives and all that kind of stuff is not ideal. But when it comes to kind of coming up with new ideas for ways to teach people language or new ideas to, motivate people to learn languages, it comes very handy for me. So I try to build out a routine to do it like once a week or so, even increasingly more recently. But once again, not doing it casually the way I know most people do, where it's just like, oh, we just smoke weed and veg out. For me, like weed really excites me, really gives me a lot of ideas, and I don't want to waste the experience. So I'll sit down with like my major business problems and like, smoke a little bit, look at them, put some music on, and just get in the zone and come up with some stuff. Like there's a lot of things right now that people are spending money, like products people are spending money on in our company and getting value out of, that originated from a high experience I had. So
exactly,
I want to write it off my taxes someday if it's possible.
Well, I bought a vaporizer, and I'm definitely going to write that off as a business expense.
Yeah, well, that's right. You can get in California, I guess. Maybe
it's like supplies and materials or whatever.
That's right, man.
For the creative breakthroughs. Yeah, exactly. Well, I think I want to dig into a couple points that you're making. I think one, I want to speak to what you're saying from the psychedelic space in a way. I think there are some people in the psychedelic space, especially because the narrative tends to drive more towards research and academia, idealism even, that people see this idea of, using marijuana for productivity or using microdosing for creativity as being a somewhat negative thing, because they're like, oh, you're just fitting within the capitalist system and blah, 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 blah. And I think what I want to make with your point and your distinction is you really obviously, you love the work that you do. You're very invested in the work that you do. You believe that what you're doing at the Mimic method, it helps to break down barriers and to connect people so that we can have a more cohesive, integrated society. Anyway, would you say that's semi-accurate, or I'm kind of hitting it?
That's 100% accurate. And for me personally, I don't really make a distinction between the spiritual and productive benefits of these substances, because for me, the overarching mission for my own personal development with these things is it's one of the tools in my arsenal for, stripping away and transcending my ego. And I find after years of doing these things, not just with substances, but meditation and self-reflection and challenging myself in different areas, that the more I peel these things away, the more creative I become. And also the more loving and compassionate I become. And when you combine creativity with love and compassion, I make better products and solutions for more people. And, one upside of that is economic return, getting paid for these things to reinvest in building more products and putting my vision out there into the world. So yeah, for me, the line between the two is really blurred. I'm not sitting here just to make money for my boss or, crank out a bunch of things to just scam some people out of money. Like, oh, it's a new way to scam people. Like, no, it's all one kind of holistic approach for me.
Right. It's like this. I mean, this is what I talk about as well. It's like this aspect of social entrepreneurship with the online language school that I ran before the third wave. It was never about the money. I wanted enough to be able to like provide for myself so that I could be independent of government, or that I could be independent of a boss, or independent of, like an employee structure. But we live very similar lifestyles. We hack credit cards for free flights all over the world. So we take advantage of the banking system, which is pretty fucking corrupt as it is, and especially in the United States. We get free miles, we travel all over, and we live pretty low income lifestyles. I mean, it's not like when we're in Lisbon, we're going out to like €60 dinners a night. It's like we're having a really nice meal for €10. we're spending maybe, a couple €1,000 a month on our own living costs, and we're putting everything else into our businesses or nonprofits or, whatever that might be. And I think it seems like that's where more and more even higher end business people are going, where there's this like really thorough understanding that money is not a very good indicator for success, and that we can use money as a tool to help change the system that we're working within from like an inside out perspective. Do you know what I mean by that?
Exactly. Yeah. Like I discovered the concept of non-materialism when I was like 16 and have been practicing it ever since. Our company is growing very fast, and, I do very well for myself, but I still don't own more than I can fit in like my carry-on luggage. And I do that purposefully because these things get in the way of what really matters. And I always remind myself the only thing that matters is my mind, my body, and the minds and bodies of the people I care about in the greater community. So any money I make is either, if it's not being invested in the company and the projects and the things I want to put out there, anything put into myself beyond like, it's really just about improving my mind and body, So I'm never going to own a car. I'm never going to own like a bunch of fancy material things. As I increase the amount of money I spend on myself, it's going into things like health or, these substances and the quality of them, and my own education and learning and joining other communities and stuff like that. And yeah, I guess it really is the only game worthwhile of playing, of like making yourself and other people better and happier and more loving and creative.
Yeah, exactly. I think the end goal is starting to change. If there even is an end goal or an end objective, I think we have been living in a world for so long where it's like, money and retirement was supposed to be the end goal, and people are now realizing that might be a bit of a false narrative, that we have to look for something beyond materialism. I mean, we were just talking about this earlier in the conversation. I think mystical experiences are going to become trendy to some degree. And I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. I think it's probably more good than bad if people are seeking for some level of connection or enlightenment or whatever it might be. But I think that will ultimately, there will be things around, having these peak experiences that signify happiness and joy and contentment and purpose and meaning. And like you said, you see spirit as being a part of your work. You don't separate the two from one another. And I also see that as being like a growing trend and growing movement with freelancers and, digital nomads or entrepreneurs like ourselves, or even, people who are more quote unquote serious entrepreneurs. People want to enjoy the work that they're doing. They don't want to feel like they need to separate things. They want to access these like states of creativity that you're talking about, these flow states, on a consistent basis as much as possible.
Exactly. I mean, look, the calculus is pretty simple. Like the equation is pretty simple. It's just, if you're doing meaningful work with people who you have meaningful relationships with, then like you're pretty golden, like this is really what it comes down to when it comes to living a good life. And everything else is either playing into that or taken away from it.
I think that's a really, really good way to simplify it, is doing meaningful work with people you care about. And this is even what I'm looking at doing at the third wave. And you're probably doing something similar with Mimic Method. And, as you're continuing to grow, is like, I'm not just building a team, so to say, but I'm also like, I'd like to build a family of sorts.
Exactly.
I think the definition of family is changing, and I'd like to create a community of people who see in similar ways and can build something for the future together that's sustainable and that's helpful for others, and that also draws on people's like strengths in a way that's productive and conducive to the health of the community or the health of the relationship or whatever that might be.
Exactly.
So cannabis, now we talked about language, we talked about cannabis. How do psychedelics then like enter the picture?
Yeah, so I have way less experience with this, but it's been a kind of passion project of mine recently. The first time I did a psychedelic was January of this year. I was in Australia and I went out to like the outback, I missed the kangaroos in the desert and took some LSD for the first time. And yeah, it was a great experience. I was looking forward to taking it for a while. And the only reason it took me so long was just because I really don't like the process finding, illicit drugs. Just the idea of not really knowing what I'm dealing with and going into shady alleyways. It just frustrates me to no end. I made the joke last night about imagine you're eating tomatoes and you want to eat some tomatoes for your pasta, but for whatever stupid reason, tomatoes are illegal in your country. So you have to go out into the street and find some shady dude selling tomatoes at €20 a tomato. And then you bring it back and it's it's not even a tomato, it's like a red pepper. You're like, God damn it. And like, and then you call your friend up like, hey man, he has some really good tomatoes. Who's your tomato dealer? He's like, oh no, I can't tell you. He doesn't want people to know who he is. I'm like, oh, it's just stupid and frustrating. It just pisses me off to no end. So I can't be bothered with it. So fortunately, I have friends who are more persistent in these areas who had procured some for me. So I went out with a friend into the outback and did some acid, and yeah, it was great. I think a lot of people doing psychedelics for the first time, there's that fear that you'll like lose your mind or have some like crazy experience. But just where I'm at in my life and just the research I've done, it's like the chances, I just look at it mathematically. I'm like, if I go crazy and like something irreversible happens to me as a result of this, then I will represent like 0.0001% of the population of people who've like done this drug. And like, I don't know, like I've always identified myself as a pretty like even keeled and like kind of go with the flow kind of person. I really think that's an unlikely scenario. So going in with that mindset, just being ready to go for the ride wherever it takes me, I think was the main reason why I had such a positive experience. And it's funny because the person I was with, she was using it for the first time as well. And she had a negative experience and she was a little bit more like anxious and came in with that kind of mindset. And she kind of had like a panic attack as a result. But I was able to kind of like walk her through it and like help her go through it, despite the fact that I was like, I don't take a lot of acid. I was like really high, like seeing stuff. But once again, just being comfortable with the experience and letting it happen to you, I was able to kind of like bring her into that energy myself. And then she ended up having a pleasant and kind of mind opening experience. The next day, she like had a lot of realizations about herself and was feeling really good. So yeah, it was great. And I've done it maybe 2 more times since then. And I've also been microdosing, trying to get into like a good microdosing routine, like once a week or twice a week as well. And each time I do that, it's a really interesting experience because all the things that like I most care about being better at, namely just being more compassionate, more creative, and more focused, those things are all enhanced on microdose with no apparent downside. It's not like and economically, it's like a microdose is like 50 cents.
Exactly.
Like, this is
it's amazing.
Like, it's amazing. Like, there's really no reason why I can't do this all the time. So, yeah. So, and then there's like a built-in like anti-addiction mechanism in it because, you can't do it twice in a row because you build tolerance really fast. So I'm like, this is literally like limitless pill in that movie. Like, so yeah, I've been experimenting with that recently, and I also have some shrooms at my disposal that I'm going to probably try out this weekend for the first time. I tried some before, but I'm not sure what happened. But it was edible, and I had a big meal before, and it just felt like a microdose. Okay. I was expecting a proper experience, but I'll just titrate up a little bit more next time.
So let's talk about that LSD experience that you had in the Outback. What, we don't necessarily have to talk about the trip itself, but did you have any sort of insights during the trip or after the trip that were unique, or you thought, I hadn't thought of it that way before? Anything like that going on with your trip? Yeah.
So, I have a lot of experience with cannabis, and that's my main point of comparison when I look at these things. And it's really interesting because there's a lot of things I can't do on marijuana. Whereas on LSD, even when I had a lot in my system and there's it's really intense experience, I could pretty much do anything I wanted to do. So for example, when my friend had a panic attack, even though I was just like in this crazy world of ideas and thoughts and sensations, I was able to kind of like bring myself down to ground reality and handle the situation practically. So I'm not sure if that's a common experience, but for me, like, I think I have maybe a more comfort with this experience than with this state of mind than I think the average person does. And the main theme or the word that comes to mind with LSD all the times I've done it is meta. And difficult for me to describe, but basically we live in a world of a bunch of just stories, right? And like, the stories of the United States of America, the story of money, and the story of these things. This is a concept that they talk about a lot in the book Sapiens by Yuval Harari, of just these fictions that society is built on. And you kind of just, over time just buy into them. They seem as real to you as objective reality. But like when I take LSD, it just kind of pops me out of it. And I'm looking at all these types of systems and like I can just see them very, very clearly. And yeah, so I'm not sure if this makes any sense to someone who's never done it before and listening, but you just get extreme perspective on all these kind of systems that are made up and stories that people tell each other intersubjectively on your own stories. That's why I think it leads to ego dissolution, because you get to take a step out yourself and say like, oh, wait, what's the story I'm telling myself about how I have to be a successful entrepreneur? Like, where'd that come from? And like just questioning things again, which I always find useful. I think perspective is the most important thing for me to pursue. So that's been the main theme so far, the times that I've done it, just really getting perspective on things and not taking stories seriously. And one funny kind of anecdote to demonstrate that was, I think the reason why people prefer to do LSD in nature, I know I definitely prefer to do it in nature, is because in nature, there's way fewer stories. Like there's these monkeys and squirrels and kangaroos aren't sitting there politicking and talking about different stupid human problems. They're just eating and pooping and like wandering around and just existing in the universality. So you just feel really like naturally in that environment. But at one point during the trip, we drive to go to, our friend drives us to go to a supermarket and get some food. And I walk into this supermarket, like standard kind of Western supermarket, and I just got blasted with sensation. Like you're playing like 3 pop songs at once. There's like cash registers and like people talking. Everyone was like really like kind of out of shape and like fat and like just colors, and it was just, I don't know, it was just so unnatural. And I remember I was hungry, and I walked up to like the basket of cashews, and like it had like the little scooper thing. It's this giant basket of cashews, and I'm just sitting there scooping it, and like everything in my human animal DNA was just like, you just discovered a bounty of carbohydrates. You need to eat this now. But I'm like, but I can't, because there's this thing called rules in front of me that aren't real, but stopping me from eating these cashews. And like, I couldn't make sense of it. It's just so weird and bizarre. And I was like, I gotta get out of here. Like, you buy these cashews, I'm gonna go and like just wait in the parking lot.
Things get overly complicated when you're on LSD in like a tight environment, right? Yeah.
And I've heard people talk about that for money too, where like you just can't really understand the concept of money when you're on these things. And the other interesting experience I had, maybe you've had this because the girl I was with had this as well, is that eating like really processed food that like, food that like didn't directly come from the ground or like from the earth just like tastes weird. It's like, so we got this chocolate bar and I was eating it, and like I felt like I can taste all the steps of manufacturing between like getting the cacao beans to like making that product. And I was like, oh, it just tasted like plastic. Meanwhile, I ate like, I don't know, some kind of fruit, and like the fruit was like delicious, and like I can taste the beauty of it. And also my visuals, I found I only hallucinated and visualized things that were organic. So I looked at my friend's skin, I could see like her veins like moving and throbbing. And when I looked at like a cereal box, which I expected to be the more hallucinogenic kind of thing because it's very colorful, I didn't see anything. So that was another interesting feature of my trip, but I have no idea how universal that is.
I mean, I get the sense that with LSD, that's somewhat universal, or at least I think that because it reflects my own first experiences. I basically tripped out for the first time when I was like 19. And I've talked about this a little bit on other podcasts, but I did it on the beach in Michigan, like in early summer, late spring, early summer. And then I did it a few weeks later on safari in Tanzania. And it was that similar type of feel that you're saying, where for me at least, it was like understanding this flow of energy that happens from like the sun to the earth, to the animals, to what we eat. And anything that was man-made that interrupted that process, I found to be very much like a turnoff and something I didn't want to be involved with.
It's like intrusive. Yeah,
exactly. It was like I wanted to. So like I remember thinking, oh, this is why, for example, people like in the 60s who were doing a bunch of LSD, that's what kind of kickstarted the green movement. And that's what kickstarted like this aspect of wanting to be vegetarian, because, they didn't want to eat these foods that had been influenced in such a way by man, because they had these really impactful experiences when they were on, tripping on LSD basically.
Yeah.
And I had that same experience. So I remember like, I think the best part of an LSD trip is like the come down. Like you take it, it starts to come on, you start to giggle. I've like vomited before. You start to have these really intense visuals, and that happens for like maybe 4 or 5 hours. And then once it settles in, you're kind of like on the come down. And I found just eating like an orange, like a really good, ripe orange, right? Like when you're doing that, there's like nothing better in the world.
Nothing better in the world.
At all. And it feels so natural, and it feels so like, even though it's not, right? It's like orange in itself as a fruit is a total is more or less like a Frankenstein man-made fruit. At the same time though, it's like, it does feel natural. It does feel organic. And I think it comes back to this, like getting in touch with this flow of energy that we perceive. And when we put ourselves in the midst of that, we come to realize, like you're saying, back to the cannabis, right? Like in our brain, it kind of flattens the hierarchy in a way.
Yeah.
This seems to also happen with LSD, where it almost makes us feel more egalitarian, more connected, more universal.
Exactly. And for anyone who gets skeptical at that type of language of connectedness and universality, another way you can theoretically look at it is, once again, like I've been really focusing recently on this idea of the stories we tell each other and tell ourselves. Like our idea of self is a story we tell ourselves. And then these drugs make you just kind of break that down. And I think in our society is a super complex human society of all these stories stacked upon stories, stacked upon stories. And there must be some certain part of the brain that's like in charge of managing that. When you see someone just like literally just go insane because they got a parking ticket or like they're stuck in traffic, and like just the reaction they have to the environment of no actual physical threat, it's as if they're about to get killed by a tiger, when in reality they're just in a very annoying situation. That kind of response to like a fiction, to an idea like that strong, there might be some part of the brain that governs that gets turned down when these substances are introduced into your biochemistry. And as a result, you come down to the ground level and you're like, oh, really? Like what's really going on is I have these oranges and these kangaroos, and like, oh shit, there's a tiger, let me get out of the way. But hey, that tiger's kind of made the same cells I'm made. So you start getting to these ground level truths, and being able to see that more clearly is I think that's why it's a therapeutic thing for people who get so anxious and depressed and identify so strongly with whatever bullshit story they're telling themselves. And then you take this substance and boom, you pop out of it and realize how bullshit it actually is. And then you eat an orange for the first time really in a long time. You're like, oh yeah, like I need to chill out. Go hang out in nature more, and even nature, just being nature sober, it does that to you,
Yeah, it helps you disconnect, and it kind of helps you realize that, like you're saying, this story, this facade of civilization that we're living in is something that can be transcended, or that we can step out of if we want, we can disconnect from. And that I think even living in cities or places where there's a lot of people, there's this kind of sense of pressure or sense of responsibility, or, this weight of life that comes down on us. And when we take LSD or other psychedelics, or when we, like you said, just even spend time out in nature, it's like it gives us a chance to just really like disconnect and unwind and come to realize that life doesn't need to be so serious, that we can,
Exactly. And when you come out of it, it gets back to our original conversation about actually doing work that matters and helping people. When these types of experiences lift you out of like the labyrinth of stories and bullshit ideas that you've been kind of brainwashed into, and you look down on the system, it gives you great power and opportunity to alter your position within that system. So you and I are talking about how we can step out, look at the system of how credit cards and banks and frequent flyer models work, and then use it to our advantage. But it also gives you a look at other systems like, oh, these people are trapped in this system. If I give them this type of information or this type of education, then they can come out of whatever, slump that they're in, So it's not to say, I think one major fear people have of taking these things is, oh, well, if I step outside of civilization and recognize the facade, then I'll just be, a hermit going and living in the mountains my whole life and drop all my ambitions. And it's not true. Like we said before, like my spirituality and my ambition and my creativity are all tied together. So when I come out of these situations, one major thing I got from that first LSD trip is just like looking down, like, oh, this is how things are. And now I have a clear idea of how things are. I can come up with more effective ways to change the way things are and more effectively help people within the system. Does that make sense?
Well, it's like what you're doing with the language learning thing. You realize that there was something that was broken, that, these huge language learning companies like Rosetta Stone, or even ones before that, Berlitz, whatever they were doing something that wasn't working. And people would often get stuck within that system. New language learners would get stuck within that system, or even experienced language learners would get stuck within that system, and they would feel frustrated. They would feel like they couldn't really speak like they wanted to speak. They couldn't really connect with other people like they wanted to connect. And you identified that. And then you said, well, let's build a new system so that we can actually facilitate those insights and that learning for people from like a language perspective. And I think, that's something similar to what we're doing here. Is we're kind of trying to reanalyze perspectives on psychedelics and look at, okay, for example, from a mental health perspective, people have been working within a failed system for a long time when it comes to mental health with, pharmaceuticals and with other types of treatment that just aren't effective. And I think, now we can look at, there are actually ways based in science and evidence that are much more effective. However, and this is something that I emphasize again and again, science and research alone won't get us there because science and research don't change hearts and minds. So we have to look at ways, okay, we have this information, we have this knowledge. How do we get people to actually change what they're doing to take advantage of it? And exactly. That, I think, that is a question that's been avoided for a long time, specific in the psychedelic space, because it's an intangible. With research and science, we can really measure it. We know, yes, we're making progress. It's immeasurable. It's easy. With an intangible, ultimately, the impact is greater. And it's going to have a greater and wider impact when you can get more and more people doing these things. But human behavior and like social psychology is a lot messier. And you're dealing with a lot more unknowns. And if you can navigate those in such a way where you can then, as we're saying, make this process of transition easier for others, then you tap into something. You tap into something that's gold, but it's difficult to do. And I think it's intimidating for people to try to take on. So they stick to easier things. I think things that are more manageable in a way.
Yeah, and I actually just made a video about this recently for a new position we're hiring for. It's discussing my values. And it really is captured by this whole conversation with the stuff where the 4 values for myself and the company are in this order: truth, growth, compassion, and education. And the idea here is you take some LSD or do all these experiences and you get a greater objectivity. You step outside the system, look down on it, and discover more of the truth. With that truth, you can improve yourself and grow yourself, transcend your ego, improve your creativity. But what comes along with that experience is an increase in compassion. When you strip away your own bullshit story, you start being stuck in your own head and feeling sorry for yourself, and then looking at other people more clearly and with a more loving eye. And then you say, oh man, I have a sincere desire to help these people now. That's where the compassion comes in. And then you think, what's the best way I can help them? I could buy them a car, but that's not going to help them. Really what they need is to discover truth of their own and grow with that truth on their own. And then maybe even, take that growth experience and then find the compassion to educate others. So that's where education comes in. So it's kind of like this virtuous cycle that all my work is really grounded in trying to propagate that cycle as much as I can before I depart this earth.
And I think in a sense, then we come back to this ability to facilitate ego dissolution. And we look at ways for people to transcend their ego and kind of get beyond the ego. And I mean, we both read this book, Stealing Fire by Stephen Kotler, right? Which talks about some of those ways that groups of people or individuals have used, psychedelics, but also various other means to transcend the ego. Because as you're saying, people, I think now more than ever, they're thirsty for spirituality. They're craving some sense of truth, some sense of deeper understanding, because I think a lot of people are waking up to the fact that we've been fed this kind of superficial, materialistic lifestyle for so long. And as a result of that, we're really missing something central to the human experience. And it's only by reconnecting with the source, so to say, or reconnecting, like what you're saying, with our community by different aspects of ego dissolution, that we can come to an objective truth and understanding of what we want. Like you're saying, you're facilitating these insights for people so that they can come to their own truth. And then once they come to their own truth, if they have principles that are grounded in compassion and love and understanding, then that it's like a natural process of evolution where communities by themselves just become better and better places that people want to spend time.
Exactly. And I don't think it's coincidence that research shows that many of these substances don't just increase your, just your objective outlook on things and not being so biased towards things, but also increases your levels of compassion. And they seem unrelated, but I don't think they are. I think they're part of the same puzzle. There is a certain truth to compassion. And so that's why these things are really interesting to me, way more than just something to do for fun on a Saturday,
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's wrap up with that. Where do you think, whether for you personally or just generally, where do you think psychedelics and cannabis and these altered states of consciousness are going to lead in the next 5-10 years? Because we talk about this. I obviously know that your strength is I think we have similar strengths in that we like to envision like future systems that we can work up to or build to facilitate these transitions. Where do you see, these substances going in the next 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, so I guess two parts, the personal and then like the larger scale one. Personally, what I'm working towards more is being more precise and deliberate with these things. I'm an experimentalist by nature, and I want to get my hands on more of these substances and try out different possibilities, not just the substance itself, but I'm actually most interested in the other parts of the equation, like set and setting, and just seeing. I recently discovered just a few months ago actually that marijuana is really useful for me for physical working out, like physical exercise. So I used to just hate stretching my hamstrings, just the worst feeling ever. And then I discovered that if I did it it feels amazing. So I'm like, just do a couple of tokes and do some yoga. And now I'm way more flexible as a result of this. And I'm thinking what are some other, so that's a different set and setting. Usually the set and setting for me was, creativity or music. Now the set and setting is, going to a park and toking up a little bit and, doing handstands and stretches and moving around like an animal. So there's just infinite possibilities and combinations of drug amount, drug combination, setting that I personally want to experiment with myself to kind of optimize my own personal goals. And then once again, I discovered that truth, use it to grow myself. I'm really curious and excited to see as these things get legalized and the taboo finally starts to kind of melt away, other people come into the space and invent new ways to use these tools and new sets and settings and, retreats and communities and other ways to use these things more creatively. At the end of the day, I've always been really into creativity, especially collaborative creativity. So that's what I'm most excited about, is just seeing how different people come together and use these things in ways that are way more creative than just going to like a techno rave and, getting so messed up you don't even know who you are anymore. That stuff doesn't interest me, but these activities for creativity and spiritual growth and physical improvement, I think there's a huge potential there. Now that, especially that these things are starting to be more, accepted both commercially and socially.
Cool. And last question that I have to ask is, where does the name Idahosa come from?
Oh, it's funny. I had a whole rant on this on that first LSD trip.
Awesome.
But with the girl I was with. So my mom is Nigerian, and in her native language of Edo, all the names are like sentences. So actually my name is 3 words. It's Idahosa, which means I listen to God. It was just interesting because I was reading a book called Gödel, Escher, and Bach. That's how I always start my LSD trips. Usually I just start reading a couple of chapters of that because it's a really deep book. And there's this whole section on I can't even get into it, but it's just way too deep. But this whole section on just kind of the concept of truth and God and all that kind of stuff. And so it was kind of an ironic name because I'm not a very I'm not at all really a religious person, but I've come to realize that doing these activities and just I'm a truth seeker at the end of the day. So I kind of see my role, my position in society is to be the person who can plug into the ether and put my ear to the ground and see if I can hear what the truth is telling us. So yeah, that's what my name means.
Cool. Any last words or any last things that you wanted to add in terms of psychedelics or what you're doing or anything else?
I guess to people who have not tried these things yet, I really want to encourage you. That's why I'm doing this podcast episode. And I was a bit hesitant to come out of the closet on this stuff at first, but I decided that one reason I would be hesitant is because, there's a lot of people who have negative prejudice against these things, but generally speaking are open-minded people. They just came from a similar background as me and, associate these things to deadbeats or something like that. So just look at people who are successful or have similar values to you and then talk to them about their experience if they've tried this. And then also remember that if you start small and focus on set and setting and do your necessary research, the chances of something extremely bad happening to you are so infinitesimal. You take more of a risk getting in a car every day and driving to work than you do doing a microdose of LSD, just the category of difference mathematically in terms of your physical risk between those two activities is many factors, basically infinite, because I'm pretty sure no one ever died from a microdose. So whereas hundreds of thousands of people die every year from car accidents, right? So if you just look at things objectively and mathematically, I just find that so many people don't try these things either because they haven't really thought through the risk and it seems way more overblown in their mind, or because they don't know people they respect who do these things. So that's why I came on this podcast. Hopefully people respect my opinion and where I'm coming from, and then they'll be more encouraged to try this stuff out.
For sure. Well, thanks for coming on, Idahosa, and telling your story and telling us about the mimic method. And maybe you can ask the guy who's been coughing behind you if he can politely shut the fuck up. But I don't know what his deal is.
I will slip some acid in the coffee.
There you go.
Yeah, to scare the truth of how not to cough on a podcast.
There you go. Yeah. And maybe next time. Well, here's some compassion for you in a drop. Okay, great. Another excellent podcast. If you enjoyed it, please leave a review on iTunes for us, as any and all reviews will help us to continue to spread the message about responsible psychedelic use and the importance of destigmatizing these substances so more people have access to them. And of course, we're back with our weekly segment, This Week in Psychedelics. Now, I am recording this, like I told you before, from San Francisco. It's also Bicycle Day, which I forgot to mention. So it's April 19 today as I'm recording. This is the day that Albert Hofmann first tripped on LSD. And he proceeded to basically ride his bicycle home from his office to his countryside village in 1943 on 250 micrograms of LSD. Wow. Can you imagine just riding a bike on 250 micrograms of LSD? That would be insane. So yeah, it's Bicycle Day, guys, and we have a pretty killer This Week in Psychedelics segment for you because there's been a lot of shit that's been going on in the psychedelic space. As I already mentioned, the MAPS Psychedelic Science 2017 conference is going on right now, or it was this past weekend, April 21 through 23. We live streamed the initial research on microdosing. So if you want a link to that, please check out our page and you can see the live stream of the initial research results for microdosing. It's exciting. It's interesting. Since I'm recording this on April 19, I don't know what they are yet, but they're going to be exciting and interesting anyway. So go ahead and make sure you check that out. In other announcements, Dr. Bronner's, the organic soap maker, has pledged $5 million to MAPS to make MDMA into an FDA-approved medicine to treat PTSD. I'll read you the first paragraph of the press release, and if you guys want more information, you are, of course, free to check it out. On the eve of the Psychedelic Science 2017 conference being held in Oakland, Dr. Bronner's, a family-owned maker of the top-selling natural brand of soap in North America, has announced it will donate $1 million per year over the next 5 years to the nonprofit Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, aka MAPS. The gift comes after MAPS was given the go-ahead by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to begin Phase 3 drug trials of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for people with treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder, aka PTSD. That's exciting news. It's just phenomenal news, as I believe one of the many ways that psychedelic substances, or illicit substances, because MDMA is more of an enactogen than a psychedelic, one of the many ways that we can destigmatize these is by making them available for medical use, because that helps people to become comfortable with them. Now, I don't believe that's the only way. I believe we need to explore multiple avenues and options, but it's definitely one of the best ways to explore it. What's next? So Jason Silva, this dude is pretty cool. He's pretty interesting. He has hosted the TV show Brain Games on Nat Geo. He just put up an important new video about mystical experiences induced by psychedelics. And I would highly recommend checking out the video. It's pretty fucking cool. Basically, it's about how mystical experiences induced by psychedelics can predict long-term positive changes in attitude, mood, behavior, and spirituality in patients. A group of scientists at prestigious research institutions like NYU and Johns Hopkins, as well as the Imperial College of London, are conducting studies with psilocybin, MDMA, and LSD, which induce mystical type experiences, and this helps to treat end-of-life distress, alcohol and drug addiction, as well as PTSD. And the video that Jason created explains the nature of the mystical experience, and like all things related to Jason, it's entertaining, engaging, and informative. So please take a few minutes. It's a 3.5 minute long video, and check it out. I think you'll really like it. Other announcement, again, today, April 19, Bicycle Day. there was an important study that was released that showed that psychedelic drugs induced heightened states of consciousness based on brain scans. Which again, wow, we already knew that, but now we have the neuroimaging studies to back it up. Basically, it says that the study records what appears to be the first evidence for mind-opening state experienced by users of LSD, ketamine, and psilocybin. So great, we have science telling us something that most of us already knew. Of course, it helps to have objective validation of the subjective experience. Basically, what the brain scans show is that people who are on these psychedelic substances have a heightened state of consciousness, and those who received LSD, ketamine, or psilocybin were found to have more random brain activity than normal while under the influence. Basically, what that means is that the shift in brain activities is accompanied by a host of peculiar sensations that the participants said range from floating and finding inner peace to distortions in time and a conviction that the self was disintegrating. In order to understand this, researchers measured the activity of neurons in people's brains as these substances took hold. Similar measurements have shown that when people are asleep or under anesthetic, their neurons tend to fire in a more predictable way than when they are awake. Now, one issue that I will take note of in this article, which I'm reading on The Guardian, and we'll provide the link, is one of the premier researchers, Robin Carhart Harris, who is the head researcher at Imperial College, basically denigrated the mystical experience, which I find to be concerning. And it's very likely that the journalist who wrote this piece probably took his quote out of context. At the same time, I think it's important to remember that the mystical experience, aka non-dual states, have been around much longer than science has and will be around much longer than science will be. And that we understand that non-dual states and these mystical experiences are critical in terms of understanding the relationship between science and spirituality. And anyone who believes that we live in a purely materialist, rationalist, reductionist world might want to reconsider your approach. And I think this is one concern that I have with the overwhelming narrative in the psychedelic space of being on science, is that we lose this understanding of aspect of this primitive wisdom that we've come to discover and understand from psychedelic states. Mystical states are not nonsense. Mystical states are something that can be understood or something that have been written about. And I think, someone like Aldous Huxley, who was a mystic and who was also a forerunner of the psychedelic movement in the 60s, would be rolling in his grave right now if he heard the quote that higher states of consciousness are mystical nonsense. We don't necessarily need to demystify the mystical experience, because the only way and the only place that eventually goes is into string theory. And as anyone who has studied string theory will tell you, strings, the smallest things that we supposedly understand, are active by vibrations, and that as they're vibrating, they create movement and other things. So while it's important to show, yes, the physiological and biological underpinnings, be cautious about reducing it down and calling mystical states nonsense. So that's that. We'll provide a link to that in the copy below. Last little announcement. Researchers at NYU are seeking to interview experienced users and dealers of new psychoactive substances. Basically, they want to hear about the use and effects of new psychoactive drugs, including things like MBOME, 2CI, Foxy, Benzofury, BZP, Meow Meow. I did not know there was a drug called Meow Meow. That's pretty fucking cool. AMT and MXE. Basically, it says, do you use any new drugs to get high? Do you sell new drugs to other people? New York University Langone Medical Center is seeking people to participate in a research study which will gather information on how to prevent harm in those who use new synthetic drugs. This is a university research study, and we have no affiliation with law enforcement. They're interested in hearing from you if you're between the ages of 18 and 35, and if you have a lot of familiarity with and or experience using or selling any of these drugs or any other new drugs not mentioned above, or you are a party or festival promoter or a pill tester who knows a lot about use of new drugs in the scene. If you're eligible, you will be asked to participate in a 1-hour interview, and you will be compensated $50 in cash for your time. No identifying information will be collected, and all information will be kept completely confidential. The interviews will take place at an NYU office. In certain circumstances, the interview can be conducted over the telephone. So go ahead and check that out if you're interested. That's going to wrap up this week in psychedelics. As always, please leave us a review on iTunes and donate to our Patreon page. We'd appreciate your financial contributions and support, because as much as I love talking about psychedelics, I still have to eat food, and eating food is nice. Having food in my stomach is nice. And unfortunately, the only way I can do that is by having money to do it. So please support us. It would mean a lot, and enjoy the rest of your weekend, day, whatever it is in your current place. Later.
Thanks for listening to the Psychedelia Podcast with Paul Austin. Want more psychedelic information? Go to our website at thethirdwave.co and register for our email list and newsletter. Also, please consider donating to The Third Wave via our Patreon page. Donations make this podcast possible. Psychedelics have the potential to transform lives. By donating, you enable us to continue to inform people about the benefits of these powerful substances.